Hello, I'm Professor Vince Petronio from the University of Rhode Island, and I'd like to welcome you to TedxURI, Decoding the Language of Climate. TedxURI brings big ideas to the world stage through the inspirational voices of our community and beyond. Our speakers challenge us to think bigger than ourselves, participate in shaping the future, and do our part in protecting the planet. Our mission is to honor these ideas and share powerful stories of imagination, innovation, and integrity that will inspire others to think big. With this vision in mind, TedxURI 2021 focused on decoding the language of climate. Depending on who we are, where we come from, our passions, interests, desires, climate change speaks a different language to all of us. Tonight, you will hear from leading climate advocates across numerous disciplines who will provide a panorama of powerful stories and perspectives on climate change. Get ready to be transported into their world, but first, we will hear from Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, an advocate for climate change science for not only the Ocean State, but the entire country. Sheldon Whitehouse will share remarks about URI's admirable contributions to protecting our planet, as well as his optimism for profound congressional action under the new administration.
Hi, I'm Sheldon Whitehouse, and I want to thank you for inviting me to join you at URI's annual TEDx. And I particularly want to thank you for making this annual TEDx about climate change. This is a good year for this to be the topic because we have big plans for getting a lot done on climate in Congress this year, and I hope we can bring those plans to fruition. URI has been immensely valuable in dealing with climate change, and I really want to thank the university for the work you've done first with CRMC, the Coastal Resources Management Council. The state of Rhode Island recognized early that the FEMA maps really weren't accurate, and people were in danger because they couldn't rely on those maps to know what was going to likely happen in major floods. URI and CRMC's coastal flood mapping is truly state-of-the-art and has set the standard for the entire country. So a big thank you and plaudits to URI for that amazing work. GSO, of course, is the Graduate School of Oceanography, and oceans are taking a real beating from climate change, whether it's the warming temperatures or the acidifying chemistry or the fleeing fisheries or the rising tides against our shores. Oceans are really a harbinger of what is to come, and GSO's great work to understand what's happening on our oceans, to understand that chemistry and that warming and what it means, not just for Rhode Island, but around the globe. URI is all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, helping people understand what we have coming. And it's not just understanding what we have coming here in Rhode Island along our coast, and it's not just understanding what we have coming for oceans all around the globe. URI had a really important role in one of the solutions to climate change, which is, of course, offshore wind. No one anywhere had been able to site an offshore wind turbine. It was just too complicated for other states. Massachusetts tried and failed after probably a decade of work. But URI and CRMC, working through the Special Area Management Plan process of the Coastal Zone Management Act, put together a program that brought all of the different stakeholders together. And as a result of that hard work, a lot of it done by URI, we were able to be the first place in the United States that got steel in the water and electrons on the grid from offshore wind. This showing of possibility has opened up an entirely new industry. Hundreds of billions of dollars and many, many jobs are going to be created. And the breakthrough was a URI CRMC effort. So keep up the good work. We have enormous amount to do, but I'm optimistic. I think we've hit a turning point. Thank you, Georgia, for giving us a Democratic Senate that won't block climate legislation. Thank you, President Biden, for having this be such a colossal priority for your administration. And thank you, Speaker Pelosi, for your leadership in the House on this. Speaker Pelosi remains, because of her leadership, the House remains the only part of government that's actually passed a serious climate bill. So the pieces are now together, and God willing, we will get the job done. But thank you to URI for all the wonderful work that you've done along the way, and I look forward to many, many continuing successes.
Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Ryan Campos is a multi-instrumentalist sound artist who has engineered and produced a range of audio works for a variety of collaborative pieces. Best known for his ambient sound design and generative composition, his work focuses on the studies of immersive soundscaping, as well as the relation between sound and feeling. Outside of the studio, Ryan performs live using modular synthesis, inviting listeners to take a deeper look into the sound. Jason Jacks, Assistant Professor of Journalism at URI, is an award-winning filmmaker and photographer whose work has been featured on National Geographic, PBS Digital Studios, the New York Times, and The Atlantic. As a visual storyteller, Jason uses the power of the image to inspire, educate, and celebrate. You know, he's traveled the world filming and photographing the natural world around us. He's witnessed firsthand the impact of climate change. And today, he brings us a strong message and challenge to take action.
So picture this. I'm face down in the water, and the water is about 40 degrees. The air above me is about 50 degrees, and I'm about 100 miles from the nearest village. I'm in the middle of the Alaskan backcountry, and I'm looking through a camera lens face down in the water, waiting for a moment. I'm waiting for a fish to swim by. You see, when most of us think of salmon, we picture a nice meal at a restaurant or a stack of fillets behind the case at the grocery store. But I'm here because I want to see what these fish look like in the water, in the wild. And when that sockeye swims past me, pushing upstream to fulfill its life history, instinct takes over and I press the shutter. And in that moment, with the river and the salmon and the mountains in the distance, I can tell a story. As a visual journalist, I use photography and film to help decode the natural world and explore our place in it. And those stories have taken me to some pretty wild places. There was the time I ziplined into a wilderness area off the coast of California. Or the time I dove in the Coral Triangle in Indonesia, which is the heart of biodiversity in the ocean. Or just this past summer, when I snorkeled in a river in Montana in search of spawning bull trout as big as my leg. I'm drawn to wild places and to the scientists that study them. And my goal when I go out there is simple, to come back with a story.
It seems that one seems to have taken.
Our world is changing, faster perhaps than we can understand. But one surefire way we can try to understand is through storytelling. Stories are the way we communicate, the way we understand ourselves and the world around us. What motivates me is the challenge of trying to distill an idea into a moment. And perhaps nowhere is this decoding and distillation more important than beneath water. Water covers nearly 2/3 of our planet, but many of us will not venture beneath the surface, that millimeters thick membrane that separates our natural environment from one where we are visitors. In venturing into the water, whether by snorkeling rivers or by diving beneath the waves, I take a camera in hopes of not only capturing what I see, but also what I feel. A deep sense of wonder and awe about our world. It's that sense of awe, I believe, that makes people stop and look and see. And we have to see now more than ever because we are an ocean planet. The ocean feeds us. It drives global climate. It makes life on Earth possible. And despite our long relationship with the sea, we still barely know it. But we are changing it. Over the last couple of years, I've begun diving into how our waste, especially plastics, enters the natural world and what becomes of it. I'm not alone. Researchers at the University of Rhode Island are trying to understand our impact on our ocean planet. But if we want the public to see just how critical healthy oceans are to our own health, then we have to find a way to connect them to a place that they might not ever experience for themselves. I believe visual storytelling has the power to do that. By connecting these issues to the public through visual media, I hope to inspire people, to share with them this sense of awe so that we can see our planet in a new light. This is an aspirational goal, of course. It's a monumental task, but I'm not alone in that either. As a professor of journalism at the University of Rhode Island, I have the privilege of working with aspiring reporters and storytellers and filmmakers, and together, we've been able to tell the stories of our changing world. I became a photographer to explore and witness and experience the natural world. And I believe in the power of visual storytelling to stop an audience and to stop the public from their daily lives, to pull them out for a moment and to have them experience that with me. And what I've learned in teaching the next generation is that it's going to take all of us to make an impact. And we are going to need all of the stories and storytellers that we can get. Thank you.
Climate change is among the most polarizing issues in American politics, creating barriers to meaningful policy solutions. Dr. Emily Diamond, an assistant professor of environmental communication at the University of Rhode Island, will share with you a new solution, emphasizing how relating climate change to different aspects of our identities might be a key to building bipartisan unity on the topic.
It's not going to surprise most of you when I tell you that we are living in a highly polarized country. Over the past several decades, the median Democrat has become increasingly liberal, while the median Republican has become increasingly conservative. This has led to a shrinking middle ground and an inability to make progress on important policy issues. One of the most polarizing policy issues is climate change. As you can see from this chart, over the past few decades, the gap in level of concern about climate change between Democrats and Republicans has diverged dramatically. This lack of bipartisan agreement has led to a total lack of meaningful policy progress on climate change and the inability of our country to agree on how much we should be prioritizing this issue. Part of the problem here is that we are stuck. We are stuck thinking about this issue through the lens of our partisan identities, through the viewpoints of our identities as Democrats and Republicans. But in reality, the issue is so much more multifaceted. It's more than a political issue, and understanding this might be the key to breaking down the partisan divisions on climate change. Growing up, I moved around a lot. At a particularly pivotal time in my life, I moved from the very liberal Pacific Northwest to a much more conservative part of the South. And once I made that move, I found that people in both places were very dismissive of each other, primarily because they differed in their political identities. But in reality, people in these two places shared many more identities. Many of those identities were much more important to them than their political identities, from their religious identities to being outdoor enthusiasts. I found that people in these two places shared a lot more common ground. Later, as I was studying this seemingly insurmountable political divide on climate change, I remembered how multifaceted people are. And I started to wonder, how might recognizing that people have many different aspects to their identities be part of the solution to breaking down this political divide? To demonstrate what I'm talking about, I want to introduce you to 3 people that I've met through my research on this issue across the country. The first is Don. Don's a soybean farmer in Illinois. He's a father of 3 and a leader in his local community. He's also a member of his county's Republican Party and the Illinois Soybean Association. Then there's Deborah. Deborah is a retired nurse in North Carolina. She has been politically conservative her entire life, but even more importantly, she's an avid birder. She spends all of her free time in her local woods looking for new bird species and is a leader in the local chapter of the National Audubon Society. And finally, there's Cheryl. Cheryl's a mother of 3 living in the suburb of Cleveland. She's active in her PTA and her local church. So what do these 3 people have in common? They seem to be living different lives, have very different day-to-day lived experiences. Well, over the past few years, all 3 of them have become active advocates for climate change and clean energy policies because of threats to important parts of their identities. You can think about identities as the way that we think about ourselves and the roles that we play in the world. Identities are important because we know from psychological research that they are among the most powerful drivers of human attitudes and behaviors, especially political attitudes and behaviors. Identities are also not unidimensional. We all have many different aspects of our identities that become more or less salient, or more or less likely to drive our attitudes and behaviors depending on our context. For example, me speaking to you today, my identity as a scholar or a researcher is highly salient, driving certain attitudes, certain behaviors. But when I'm at home, my identity as a caretaker or as a community leader might become more salient, driving different attitudes and different behaviors. Recognizing the multifaceted nature of identities and the important role that they play in driving our political attitudes and behaviors is part of the solution to breaking down this partisan divide on climate change. So let's check back in with our research subjects. Don, as I mentioned, he's an active Republican, but even more importantly, he is a farmer. And over the past few years, he's noticed changing weather patterns that have impacted his crop yields and made it more difficult for him to provide for his family. He recognizes that climate change threatens his identity as a farmer and his family's way of life. And this has led him to become an advocate for clean and renewable energy throughout his region. Looking at Deborah, a few years ago, Deborah read a report done by the National Audubon Society that found that 2/3 of bird species in North America are threatened with extinction by the year 2100 because of climate change. This includes Deborah's favorite bird, the brown-headed nuthatch. Recognizing the existential threat that climate change poses to birds and Deborah's birder identity, she now uses this as an entryway to talk to her friends and neighbors about supporting climate change policies. And then finally, there's Cheryl. Cheryl's never been particularly politically active, but at a recent PTA meeting, she attended a presentation by a member of the organization Moms Clean Air Force. This is an organization that unites parents in support of climate change and clean air policies for the sake of their children's generations. After hearing that presentation, Cheryl started to view the issue of climate change not through the lens of her political identity, but through the lens of her identity as a parent. This has led her to become a climate change activist herself, joining the organization Moms Clean Air Force to fight for climate change policies across the country. So for all 3 of these individuals, their attitudes and their behaviors towards climate change shifted once the issue was related to an important part of their identity. And this might be part of the solution to overcoming that partisan divide on climate change. If we can identify more identities that are threatened by the issue of climate change and develop communication strategies to help people view climate change through the lens of those alternative identities, we might be able to break down the partisan divides and build bipartisan support for urgent climate change mitigation policies.
Amy Gautau was born in South Carolina and is a Japanese-American cellist. She began playing the cello at the age of 3. She made her debut as soloist with the Charleston Symphony Orchestra at age 9. In 2015, she received the Hope Award at the 9th International Tchaikovsky Competition for Young Musicians held in Russia. She was a featured performer on NPR's show From the Top in 2018, and most recently, she competed as the youngest contestant at the Mazzacurati competition in Turin, Italy, in the fall of 2019. Amy is also a recipient of a scholarship from the Joy Conservatory at the University of Connecticut since fall 2017, and she currently resides in Rhode Island. Advancements in ocean technology enable us to observe the ocean interior, the twilight zone, on vast scales. Melissa Omand, assistant professor at the Graduate School of Oceanography at URI, studies transport and separation of carbon in the ocean. Next, you will hear Professor Omand's plan to release hundreds of tiny glass robots, she calls her minions, as deep ocean sentinels, tracking the vertical transport of carbon from the surface to the deep sea.
The theme of this TED series is decoding the language of climate. I study the ocean, and to me, the language of the ocean is through the data that we collect. 100 years ago, we needed to collect a single sample of water in order to be able to get a word of that language. 50 years later, we could construct sentences of this language through the development of sensors that could provide strings of numbers that would allow continuous monitoring. Now we're in an environment where we can collect paragraphs of information, huge data sets, particularly through the development of technology surrounding acoustic measurements and imaging tools. I study a part of the carbon cycle called the biological carbon pump, but you might be more familiar with what we call the inorganic pump, the process by which CO2 in the atmosphere is dissolved at the sea surface, and then through mixing processes and subduction, it's folded into the deep ocean. This balance, this exchange of carbon through a biological form and then remineralization back into an inorganic form in the deep ocean is very similar to the cycle that occurs in our forests every year. So in the fall, trees drop their leaves, those leaves accumulate on the floor and then are remineralized by bacteria and broken down back into an inorganic form that can eventually be used by the tree the following spring during the next bloom. Our oceans are very similar to this in that they have phytoplankton that are fixing that carbon through photosynthesis. Some of that material is packaged and reprocessed into detrital particles that then sink out from the surface into the deep sea. On the way down, most of that material is remineralized by bacteria and converted back into an inorganic CO2 form. A tiny fraction of it actually does reach the seafloor, and this is actually what eventually becomes our fossil fuels over millions of years. What my lab has developed is an imaging tool for monitoring what we call the biological carbon pump. This technology derives from technology that's actually been in existence for over 50 years. An autonomous instrumented package that can be deployed off of a research vessel. It's pre-ballasted so that we've added just the right amount of weight so that it can sink down and hit an intermediate level in the ocean, somewhere inside what we call the twilight zone, the region below the sunlit surface and the abyss. These instruments are deployed for periods of days to weeks and eventually maybe even years. They have sensors on board that allow us to monitor the temperature, the salinity, the oxygen concentration and changes in oxygen, and also take photographs of what we call marine snow. The way that they do this is by drifting in a water-following frame that allows the snow particles that are falling down from being produced by phytoplankton above, and they land on an imaging surface that's upward facing and provide us with a time-lapse view of the accumulation of these particles. At the end of the mission, the minion will drop its weight and then flip over and come back up to the surface. On the other side, on its head, is the tools that we use to be able to transmit the data through satellites back to the ship or to shore. The reason why I'm building tools to be able to monitor the biological carbon pump is because we don't yet understand how this very complex process that constitutes a huge quantity of this carbon exchange will change under a changing ocean and a changing climate. 100 years ago, we needed to collect a single sample of water in order to get one word of the ocean's language. Imagine with me now a future where the ocean is filled with thousands of robots, my minions among them, that are collecting vast data sets that will allow us to fill books and libraries with the ocean's stories.
Clothes are essential to humankind. For thousands of years, their value reflected their importance and the challenges in making them. Now, clothing has become cheap and disposable, and we've been buying more and more. We still need clothes, but do we need quite so many? Can buying fewer clothes contribute to a better environment and a healthier planet? Let's hear from Professor Martin Bide. Bide grew up in England and, after earning degrees in color chemistry, spent some years in the UK dye-stuff industry before joining the academic world of New England. He's become a professor in the Department of Textiles, Fashion, Merchandising, and Design at URI for over 30 years.
Hello. If this were a live audience, I'd begin by saying it's nice to see everyone wearing clothes. But even if I can't see you, I doubt that there are many watching who are not wearing them. We need clothes. Humans need to eat, a safe place to sleep, and clothes. They keep us warm and dry, we maintain a degree of modesty, or we can show others which tribe we belong to or how cool we are. Thousands of years before we settled down to farm, while we were still hunter-gatherers, we covered ourselves, and we replaced animal skins with textiles that were comfortable, didn't impede our hunting or farming, and were durable. Humans figured out how to retrieve 100 million tiny fibers from plants or animals, organize them into yarns, weave the yarns into fabric, color it, and sew a garment. It's clever stuff. It's done by hand. It's a painstaking process, especially making the yarns. There's about 2 miles of yarn in my shirt. The men are working in the fields, mothers are looking after children. Who's got the time to make yarns? The unmarried women, the spinsters, get it? And that stick is the distaff. We still talk about the distaff or female side of the family. Textiles are embedded in our language. We weave through traffic. We're on tenterhooks. We have spin-offs. We follow threads. So textiles are essential. They take time and effort to make. They're valuable. How valuable? The best textiles are treasures. They're in museums. Most ordinary ones were repaired, altered, repurposed, handed down, and eventually became rags. Even rags have value. I'm old enough to remember the rag and bone man and his horse-drawn cart coming around the streets where I grew up in England. So if you want to get a textile curator excited, forget the wedding dress or the ball gown. Give them some working men's pants from a couple hundred years ago. In the 1700s, we had an industrial revolution. We harnessed steam power. What should we use it for? What's valuable? Textiles. We mechanize spinning, weaving, sewing. We invent factories and mills, and cities to house the workers. And as every Rhode Island schoolchild knows, America's Industrial Revolution began at Samuel Slater's mill. In the 1800s, we figure out chemistry. What should we use this for? What's valuable? Textiles. Let's make dyes. And today's chemical giants can trace their origins to success in the dye business in the late 1800s. Let's stop the clock for a moment at 1900. Fibers are still natural: cotton, wool, linen, silk. Farming's organic. And despite this efficient mechanized production in large textile mills, the world produces enough textile for about £5 per person per year. That's everything: clothes, sheets, curtains, towels. A pair of jeans is about £1. But what did we lack? We were clothed. We knew how to be fashionable. What was missing? Not much. But we wanted more. The The first step of more was not textile related. It was the process to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. That meant more food and our ability today to feed a population of almost 8 billion people. Incidentally, it also shuts the door to organic farming as a global supplier of food or fiber to that many people. In textiles, more was the invention of oil-based synthetic fibers, starting with nylon. These are brilliant materials. For many uses, so much better than natural fibers. We fell in love with them. When they were newly available to us after the war took them, we rioted to get them back. And polyester arrived, as cheap as cotton. Meanwhile, manufacturing becomes ever more efficient. Those mills need fewer workers to spin and weave. And in the same way, other factories become less labor-intensive. Production lines for cars and trucks have more robots than humans. But we still haven't developed a robot that can sew a shirt. The billions and billions of garments we wear require that some skilled human sits at a sewing machine. We chase the cheap needle, finding those humans who will work for the lowest wages. And we arrive in a 21st century textile world in which efficient farming grows cheap cotton, polyester is derived from cheap oil, highly efficient machines make low-cost fabric, garments are sewn by low-wage workers. And most of us can't fix a seam or replace a zipper or a button. Our clothes are cheaper and cheaper. A $10 t-shirt from 1990 today would cost $10. That's not true of anything else we buy. So instead of buy, keep, repair, we buy, throw it away, and buy more. Hello, fast fashion. And despite all those yellow bins, textiles are tough to recycle in any meaningful way. And the waste is part of our current microplastic pollution problem. Textiles are already micro when we throw them away. So while our population has quadrupled since 1900, our textile consumption has gone up 30-fold. More than £30 per person per year, and at more than 100 in the United States. And most of the fiber we use is polyester. There's not enough land to grow more cotton. 30 times more textile. We don't eat 30 times more food. We don't live in 30 houses each. We have too much stuff in our wardrobes. How full is yours? So where do we go from here? How much textile fiber do we need? How much can the Earth reasonably and sustainably produce? And sustainability is not about the quality of what you buy. If you ask the question, is this a sustainable garment? It's the wrong question. It's about the quantity. How many of these can the world provide? And the answer is less. We can happily, but not organically, grow 10 pounds per person of natural fibers. We can produce a few pounds each of synthetic fibers. They're much better in some uses, and a better use of oil than burning it to make more carbon dioxide. Does it have to be global? We cherish local food from local farmers. Why not local textiles? It's not so long since we had small mills that could take local wool, wash it, spin it, weave it, dye it, and finish it into fabrics. And here in Samuel Slater's home state, we still have a vibrant textile industry. We still produce wool and turn it into useful textiles. We have regional initiatives to do this on a bigger scale and produce high fashion garments. Maybe the pandemic has shown us that we don't need to dress so differently so often. How much of your wardrobe has gathered dust since we socialized less and Zoomed more? And maybe sewing is as good as binge watching as a way of spending time that you are not socializing. There are good clothes out there, clothes that will look good and last a long time. You don't need so much. Designer Vivienne Westwood said it well. Buy less, choose well, and make it last. And I'm wearing the Harris tweed jacket that I wore to my interview at URI in 1990.
Hi, I'm Carl Aspelund, the Department Chair of Textiles, Fashion, Merchandising and Design in the College of Business at the University of Rhode Island. When you talk about climate change, you have to be inclusive. You have to think about the various populations involved and make sure that not only are you addressing their needs, but that you're hearing their voices. Now, I just got off the phone with Sean Rogers, who is the Director of Inclusive Excellence in the College of Business. He's got a lot of interesting things to say. So I invited him to join me on Zoom, and I'm just going to settle in here and let's give Sean a listen. So here's the thing. We find ourselves in a dilemma, and you have some interesting perspectives on this. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about the climate crisis. And we find that even in our program, in our broadcast, we are, first of all, not as diverse a group as we would like to be. And secondly, possibly following on from that first point, we are not addressing the social injustice involved in climate change. And you had some interesting thoughts on that. You had in our phone call just now. Could you go back to that and talk about those 2 or 3 points?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to, Carl. And thank you very much for reaching out to me and sparking this conversation. I think it's outstanding that there was a recognition of what might have been missing in terms of not only visible presenters, but also concepts and topics that are important and central to a discussion on climate change.
There's almost an organic process that makes that happen. And you talked about that on the phone just now, this way that we just kind of grow into this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you're putting together a group from the start that's going to tackle a task, tackle a project, it's very important to be intentional about what voices and perspectives are part of that group, because the end result is going to reflect the diversity, or on the flip side, the homogeneity of those perspectives, right? Because we sort of we exist in our circles. Our circles tend to reflect our preferences, our identities, and so on and so forth. And so if we don't have those really broad identities, perspectives at the table from the start, then it's really hard to be intentional about then creating an end result that reflects the broadness that we'd like it to have, right? So that's the sort of first thing here, the intentionality.
So what does an institution like ours, a team, maybe even a government organization or an NGO, what do we do in trying to make sure that we are being inclusive and that we are looking at things from the point of view of groups that are, well, traditionally not represented?
Well, it's all about, again, being intentional. So you have to have at least one person who is raising the issue during the formation of these groups, right? And saying, hey, look around. Does this represent the environment, the world, the whatever that we want, right? And if not, let's take active steps right now to create that community, create that diversity of perspectives, of representation that we want, right? So it just has to be something that you're thinking about from the get-go. And then you invite those individuals to participate, right? You just invite people to participate. So I would say, how do you get there? You have to be really overt about it. You have to be intentional. You look around the room and you say, hey, does everyone look like me? If so, that is a problem, because we might be missing things here. We might then end up, we've got blind spots that we may not even realize are blind spots. This is a process that Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, a leadership professor at Harvard Business School, wrote about as early as 1975 in a seminal book. She called it homosocial reproduction. It's not nefarious. It's not malicious. It's not intended to exclude certain individuals. But what it is when we expand, when we invite people to participate, when we look for people to join our organizations or whatever else, we tend to, if we're going to use sort of a referral type of approach, we tend to reach back to our own networks. And our networks, by and large, our social networks, professional networks, and whatever else, by and large, reflect us. They reflect our identities. They reflect our preferences. They reflect our circles. They reflect our educational institutions, et cetera, right? They reflect our community organizations. They reflect our neighborhoods. And so if we solely rely on who do I know, well, I mostly know people who are like me.
It occurs to me that we can use this sort of microcosm of URI and this program and this, and that we can make it into a larger issue in terms of the approach toward the climate crisis, where that kind of intentionality in a group of scientists or in a group of thinkers, whether it's in the humanities or in the STEM fields or even in the arts. How could you see that playing out?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's you bring together, and I like your point about really bringing together people from different avenues, or different academic disciplines, different interest areas. You got to be intentional in that way too, right? You got to find people who are really passionate about what it is they do, but also passionate about collaborating with others across boundaries, learning, right? Learning new perspectives and allowing their attitudes and thinking and behaviors to be influenced by what they learn. There has to be a level of openness. There has to be a level of willingness to learn on the part of individuals. And so when you can tap into not only different or people with different identities and different perspectives and different lived experiences, but also find ways to engage them in a learning process whereby everyone is learning from one another, really creating an environment where inclusivity and diversity and learning is not only valued and respected, but is, and I'm going to push you here, is encouraged and expected. Expected, okay? Because that's what's ultimately going to push us towards these inclusive communities.
That's a really good point. The willingness to learn is important. I hear that and I appreciate that, but the expectation of the willingness.
And perhaps that'll be my last point, this notion of expectation. So all too often, organizations, programs, institutions view inclusive environments as a nice to have or as aspirational. And this is, and certainly it is aspirational, but it's aspirational in that one day we will get there. When you're aspirational and hopeful, as opposed to expecting, right, then that sort of gives individuals, that gives organizing committees a pass to not be intentional about things. The Americans with Disabilities Act moved from aspirational and hopefulness to we have to find a way for people with mobility limitations to be able to get around the city. And so what that means is carve these curbs. And what that means is kneeling buses. Make it happen, right? There's a level of This has to happen, not, for many years, that was very much in the United States in the 70s and before. Yes, it's just a thing that ought to happen, and hopefully it'll eventually come. And even with the passage of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act in the early 70s, there still wasn't teeth around that to make it happen until later, when you had folks that said this has to happen. And so around diversity, equity, and inclusion, let's move from aspirations and hopes to it has to happen.
Make it happen. That's the thing. Make it happen.
That's it. That's it. Make it happen.
Make it happen. Don't wish for it. Make it happen. All right. Well, thank you, Sean. Man, I'm so happy we talked.
Yeah, this was great. And as always, we always have wonderful conversations. These are challenging conversations. These are difficult conversations, particularly when you're talking about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But they're conversations that need to happen, and individuals like us who are willing to engage, that is what is going to move us towards progress, right? Willingness to engage in the conversations.
Ian Lynn is an 11-year-old pianist, violinist, and composer. He's won many awards in piano competitions as well as music composition competitions. And he's the youngest member of the Rhode Island Philharmonic Youth Symphony Orchestra. He loves sharing music with others and gives annual solo concerts for seniors at a few nursing homes in Rhode Island. Addressing climate change is not just for scientists, engineers, and policymakers. In fact, it can be seen and felt in the work of many different professions, including artists. Caleb Hawkins is an architectural designer and visual artist. He's currently in his last year pursuing a Master's of Design Studies degree in technology at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he is a researcher at the Responsive Environments and Artifacts Lab. Now, he will show us how art has a role to play in the bigger picture of addressing environmental changes by acting as a means of translation for what nature has to say.
Hello, my name is Caleb Hawkins. Climate change is now a very popular topic within our society as it has been embraced in politics, the sciences, and engineering. All of these fields continue to work towards solutions, policy, and products that aim to help heal our planet. Even with the backing of these concrete studies, some people are still unconvinced that these environmental changes are man-made. Bringing awareness to those who are unexposed to these global changes is one of the most important steps to gaining a unified front. But how do all of these areas of study come together to effectively communicate our circumstances to everyone? Trained as an architect, I've come to understand drawing as one of the earliest forms of communication outside the use of the body. Imagery and visual understanding is one of the most relied upon means of communication, and in a way, is a language in and of itself. As a person, I only speak English, but as a designer, I speak many other languages. I speak computer languages to connect different devices and sensors. I speak languages of material properties like concrete, wood, and metal to understand how they come together in construction. I speak the language of creative tools to understand what to use and when. I speak the language of emotion when feeling for others besides myself. I see many different things unified by shared languages, some recognized and known, and some completely foreign. There are people in our society that speak the language of drawing freely and creatively, open upon the world, unbound by proper syntax, formatting, grammar, or code. They communicate in ways that go beyond words. These people are artists, and I am proud to consider myself a member of this unique group. As an artist, I'm continuously exploring and discovering new connections that can be made between techniques, mediums, ideas, and general contrasts. I seek uncharted disciplinary edges and straddle them. Placing myself on the edge is also placing myself in between, and I'm fascinated by how things can come together. As an artist, I see myself as a translator or a mediator of sorts. Even when two things are seemingly so different from one another, my process is anchored in finding a common ground or language between them. Art, in a way, has its own poetic language, understood through our experience of it, like the way it looks, the way it sounds, what it feels like to be in front of it, and what it feels like to be a part of it. Climate change is a big problem to wrap your head around, especially when thinking about all the different variables, calculations, and ecosystems involved. Its networked complexity is nearly incomprehensible by one person or one profession. But art has this interesting way of synthesizing these multi-layered complexities of climate change. It does this through its ability to inspire collaboration and question where the edge is drawn between disciplines and professions. It has the ability to help frame and communicate through metaphoric relationships that expand outward from disciplinary silos into the world. Art has the ability to connect mediums, ideas, cultures, professions, and people. How these things become connected depends on the way you look at them, listen to them, and understand them. When thinking about the creation of an artwork for the ocean, I wanted to think of ways to work with it and not against it. The qualities and power of the ocean has a lot to offer, especially in a creative sense. I like to search for inspiration or consider certain qualities like form, materiality, and function that can help inform and influence my design language. They're like the ingredients you select when trying to cook up something nice. For message in a bottle, or MIAB for short, I looked at the way engineers design wave generators that produce electricity by capturing their constant up and down motion. These devices are like really fancy buoys that float and bob on the ocean surface. I looked at the sea creatures that live deep below the surface of the ocean, and I'm still amazed by their ability to glow. This bioluminescence is also a form of communication. Messages sent in a bottle were used in many ways, like to track ocean currents, send distress messages, or report information from distant explorations. While these uses are more informative, other uses were more poetic and almost spiritual, with people sending poems, love letters, or even the ashes of loved ones. The sealed bottle protects what's inside. Messages have lasted over 100 years before they were found. They have this ability, this power to act as a time capsule for future generations. It's a very old form of communication, but its simplicity and effectiveness is beautiful. Just 3 things: a bottle, a piece of paper, and the message written on it. There is a message in the ocean. It's being expressed every day, directly in front of us. But what message would the ocean write to us? Message in a Bottle is a kinetic, ocean-based floating artwork influenced by all of these things to poetically synthesize the differences through the language of art. It is a real-time translator of wave movement into graphic notation. As it rises and falls with the tide, the vertical clear tube remains upright, ballasted by an internal weight, like a buoy. This vertical feature of the piece essentially becomes the bottle, which holds the message encapsulated within. Inside the clear tube is a suspended plane. On one side, there is a reflective material that colors and reflects light from the sun onto the water during the day. On the other side, there is a luminescent material that glows during the night, becoming the paper. This material is activated by UV light that floats freely up and down the vertical tube in the waves. The UV light charges the luminescent material during late afternoon and evening hours. A temporary glowing trail, an afterglow of the wave's motion, is scribed to this material. This moving light becomes the pen, illuminating the message and capturing the story of the ocean. MIAB is an artwork designed to push forward the story of the ocean by translating it into a language of the everyday experience near the shoreline. Artistic and poetic translation of the ocean's waves into writing expands our perception of what the ocean has to teach us. It becomes an answer for those who have ever wondered what the ocean has to say. As our culture begins to accept and take action towards climate change, finding new ways of understanding is pivotal to comprehending its complex effects. I believe that art can play an important role in expanding this understanding, and it can present the public with new perspectives.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of TedxURI, Decoding the Language of Climate. We hope you found the presentations informative and inspiring. Please join us for part 2 of this series on April 3rd at 7:30 p.m.
Oxygen. It's all around us. We breathe it. We couldn't get by without it. Frankly, maybe we take it for granted. Can you imagine a world without it? Well, take off that imagination hat and look no further than our oceans. There's a world without oxygen developing right now in our oceans.
A lot of traditional theorizing about responsibility assumes that all individuals can utilize their personal agency in that unrestrained way to address any of their wrongdoings. This, however, is completely unrealistic.
Not everyone is going to be moved, so moved today. The message needs to be consistent and constant. Eventually, that person in the future will receive that message, will receive that book of names.
So who would you most like to have a conversation with?
I would love to talk about this with somebody like Martin Luther King. His reach, his story, his message, his knowledge, what he was sensitive to, how he saw the big picture.